when I look at an object, for example, there's a horizon to that object. And what that means is that anytime I'm looking at a book, for example, I can't immediately see the other side of the object. And even if I turn it around to see that side, I still can't see the side that I just turned around. And human philosophy of perception is always limited in this way. And so this is another insight that they have about the limitation of sense data that previous philosophers may not have picked up on or focused on. Because, again, remember, if we're going to be consistent with David Hume, if I'm limited by my sense data, wait a minute, there's actually a whole bunch of things I'm not immediately sensing. So the question the bar gets raised even higher. Wait a minute. And when we say that we only are justified in believing our immediate sense data or what we can prove from sense data, that's a tall order. Like, I'm not perceiving China. I'm not perceiving the other side of my hometown. I'm not perceiving the other room. You see how limiting this is.
Right.
So again, philosophy is just in this constant process of conversation of dissecting and refuting the generation before, or the schools the generation before, right?
Right.
So I mean, I don't mean to ramble about this, but all of that was just to point out that more and more sophisticated questions and insights get raised as philosophy progresses and as these schools form and develop, and nothing gets done. That's the point, or nothing actually gets solved, because in all of these secular philosophical schools, which may have insights, as Lakatos says, they never are able to answer the more fundamental challenges and questions that Hume raised.
Right. So continuing and just ending this line into the 20th century, then the student of Husserl is Heidegger, Martin Heidegger. And so he develops his phenomenology, being in time. And so the new universal, because we can't extrapolate due to the Kantian critique, due to the limits of empiricism, the new one is just being itself. That is the universal. And so this is the new foundation then within the phenomenological enterprise. That leads into, so he has a book called Being in Time, then Sartre's book, Being in Nothingness, that this whole phenomenological, universality of knowledge and epistemology leads to actually there's nothing there. I am. So then Sartre almost blends together the phenomenology and the phenomenal sense data, that all I am is really back to like a John Stuart Mill, where there is no self. What I am is I'm being imprinted on by sense data, and what I consider a mind is just I can reflect on sense data. So I had an idea, yesterday, and so I can think. That is the process of thinking, is reflecting on sense data. And so for Sartre, then his existentialist phenomenological enterprise is you make yourself in the world through will and all this different stuff. Again, circular. Foundationally circular, and that's why then it leads to no objective truth. There is no objective truth in a Sartre. Heidegger was
this is where philosophers begin to basically just dispense with the older requirements.
Yeah.
They say, we're done. I mean, there's just no answer to these questions. And so the move from these really highbrow continental philosophers and their attempts to save metaphysics with Heidegger and whatnot, again, not to say that there won't be insights in those philosophers, but that the projects end up failing. I think in Husserl's case, he ended up going off into something basically Buddhist, right? Which is, so he kind of just gave up, and adopted these incoherent philosophies of more or less Buddhism. I mean, I don't even I've tried to read the later Husserl, and I don't even know what he's saying. It's almost undecipherable.
Yeah. No,
and I think Heidegger saw a lot of these problems in Husserl, and he critiques Husserl and basically tries to come up with these kinds of, like you said, these concrete universal principles like being that we can latch onto. But of course, as we know as presuppositionalism, there's no raw, uninterpreted idea of what being is. I mean, what does that even mean?
Exactly.
Right? I mean, it just assumes again, and it's another attempt at human system building that is trying to not answer kind of fundamental questions again that have been raised since Hume. So we can appreciate at least Husserl's attempt to want to go back to metaphysics, to want to reinvigorate some of these disciplines that had seemed to be dead or whatever.
Right.
But whether these projects are successful is another issue, and I don't think that they are, because I don't think any autonomous man-based system or approach is going to work. It's not going to be able to solve these issues, because all they can ever refer back to is the man who invents or creates that system.
Exactly.
And it's always going to be a limited, human, finite system that is not going to be able to answer these fundamental, human problems of induction. And if by the way, there's no induction, then also deduction fails. Right. Mannion has a good critique of that. So all of these problems that Hume raises then basically destroys the process of justifying beliefs in epistemology. And that's why the Quine paper is so important, because epistemology in the 20th century gets naturalized, and by that it means it just turns into psychology.
Right.
So basically, there's not any clear, he's arguing, distinction between analytic and synthetic truth. This breaks down. If we're empiricists, the problems are the same since Hume, and so it's time to really just surrender the discipline of epistemology and give up on it. And so many people don't realize that when you do that, then the schools that you're talking about are the logical conclusion of postmodernism, existentialism. So those systems no longer care about
at all
the questions of justification. We don't care about that, man. Those are dumb, spurgy questions of people in the ancient medieval world, and and the Enlightenment philosophers, and we don't care about that anymore. Now what we're going to do is, and then it basically becomes each sort of philosopher kind of inventing his own little school of groupies about his cool idea, right? Like mine is and this is where Wittgenstein is insightful, because he basically says philosophy is just a bunch of weirdos doing therapy.
Right. No, you can appreciate Wittgenstein, and that's where I want to go next, because at least he gets elevated as like a logical positive prodigy with his Tractatus, and then he's like, I don't know, I'm not so sure about it. By the later Wittgenstein, he's basically undermined the entire logical positivist school that he was lifted up to be the prodigy of. And so I want you then, flipping over to the other side of this post-Kantian, post-Humean stream, is empiricism. So we go from Locke and Hume into people like John Stuart Mill. And then from there, we get this focus on the hypothetico-deductive model of epistemology, which leads into the Venetian school of logical positivism. And so dive into this logical positivist. Okay, so they're going to what they believe to do is accept Hume's critique. They're gonna accept Kant's critique, and they're gonna come up with a better way to understand reality. And this is where we start to get into this philosophy of language. So can you speak now into logical positivism and how that connects with empiricism and brings us into the 20th century?
Yeah, I mean, it again is another attempt to draw out a lot of really silly starting points that end up basically being very arbitrary. So I think I have an essay I wrote many years ago. It's kind of fuzzy, but I went into Rudolf Carnap and some of these guys that come out of that tradition, and what the Vienna school tries to do is, like you said, somebody like Bertrand Russell would be another person that would be representative of this kind of system, to where they think that they can basically create a fully encapsulated system of logic or mathematics that would, in a kind of a one-to-one correspondence way, match up to reality. So they come up with these correspondence theories of truth, correspondence theories of language that, the linguistic philosophy is not a problem because the word bat just is a one-to-one correspondence to that thing over there. And so it's all these really just low IQ, low tier, like it's almost like a commonsensical type of approach at the same time as trying to have these really elaborate, Russell thinks that he can create a perfect math set theory that will explain all of reality.
Yeah, an ideal language that if you spoke it correctly, it would accurately map onto reality itself. So this mind phenomena separation. He's trying to bring it back with the use of language and mapping language logically onto the phenomena, because he's not making a case for soul substance. He's not making a case for universals. He's just making a case for what's the best way that we can know the world, referring back to mathematics.
And this is where Wittgenstein is helpful and actually funny, because he eventually starts asking questions, as you said, about language, and he's known probably most famously for the idea of language games, that language doesn't actually operate the way these people think.
Right.
And if you're going to do symbolic language structures or systems that are supposed to represent meaning or numbers or math or logic, then you're going to have to give an account for how words mean and how symbols mean. And this is where semiotics starts to come into play and become really important. The philosophy of signs and symbols, and Charles Sanders Peirce and Saussure, these different characters, and they matter because they really dig into this issue of symbols and reference, sign reference, and so
semiotics.
Forth. And so, Wittgenstein basically points out that, look, there's not really any way to make sense of language and linguistic philosophy without assuming language and linguistic philosophy. And so even though he's basically coming to the realization of the circularity in words and meaning, and he's basically just calling it a game, it's very insightful for us, because it's going to give us good insights into how systems like Russell's ideas and whatnot don't actually work and do what they think it does.
Right.
And so, Wittgenstein has this idea where he, makes all these arguments, and then at the end of the book, he's basically saying that, by the way, we don't actually know that words mean. So, but he's written a whole book saying that it's word games.
Right.
Do you see how that would be self-refuting, right? Yeah. Like I wrote a whole book, but by the way, my book is a joke and it's just word games and it doesn't actually mean, and it doesn't prove anything. And this gets us postmodernism and deconstructionism. This is where the deconstructionists, the Derridas, come along and they say, well, nobody can actually know the author's intent. And if we can't know the author's intent, then really meaning is a social construct. Meaning is imposed on the text based on power relations and oppressor oppressed narratives. And that's where that goes off into Frankfurt School stuff, right? So really, again, the point of all this is just to point out that philosophy, once again, comes back to this dead end. The logical positivist stuff falls apart. People eventually just discard that kind of stuff because it just gets devastated and critiqued by so many philosophers.
And so regarding some of these critiques, so logical positivism brings us into the early 20th century. And again, it's this emphasis on logic and mathematics. If we can map this ideal language, then we can map language directly onto reality.
And that will create this kind of perfect total system.
Yeah.
Right?
And so this whole system, this logical positivism, is based on, again, this hypothetical deductive model, the empirical verifiability principle. And so then with people like Quine then raise, can you empirically show me the empirical verifiability principle? And this is where then the whole tradition starts to fall apart, this logical, because this is the circularity that everybody begins to realize in the 20th century, is that, wait, this whole logical positivism, you just assumed your principle of justification that can't be justified based on your own principle of justification.
Yeah, Father Deegan has a really good paper critiquing Quine's naturalized epistemology and showing and kind of making arguments along those lines. I think it's called Naturalized Epistemology. That PDF is in the Discord if anybody's interested. It's a really good paper from Father Deacon, and he's making your point there that